Hey gang, what's a crack-a-lackin'? It's time to do the other side of the 1950s, the pop culture side of the 1950s, calling it post-war consensus and rebellion. Moving on. Well, you'll recall that Harry Truman became the president toward the end of World War II, following the election of Franklin Roosevelt to his fourth term. Harry Truman, although he is known as the man who dropped the bomb, the atomic bombs on Japan, he is known as the man who valiantly led the fight against the Soviet Union in the Berlin airlift and the Truman Doctrine and all of these things. It's important to keep in mind that Harry Truman never wanted to be a Cold Warrior. He thought of his vision, he thought of his role as one in which he would continue to develop and expand the New Deal, which was begun under his predecessor, Franklin Roosevelt. He called his post-war vision the Square Deal, which was an expansion of the welfare state. If it sounds a little bit like the New Deal, you're right. If it sounds a little bit like the Square Deal, which was developed under Theodore Roosevelt, you're right. He thought of these two programs as his working models. For example, he calls for the expansion of Social Security to cover more people and under more circumstances. He calls for the right for a useful and remunerative job. He calls for a national health care program. This had been something that the Franklin Roosevelt administration had tossed around during the New Deal, and Truman wants to continue that program to get a national health care program. Even now, with Barack Obama as president, we do not have a national health care program. What we do have is health care reform, so do not confuse the two. He calls for the expansion of the rights of organized labor unions, and this is what is known as Cold War liberalism. Well, slow down, Harry Truman. You're not going to get everything you want. The reason is because the Republicans are going to retake Congress in 1946. This is the first time that we've seen Republican control of both the House and the Senate in 14 years. And they have an ambitious plan to roll back the New Deal. They are calling for an end to New Deal spending. Let's bring the budget back into equilibrium, and let's scale down the social programs. They will, however, continue to support spending in order to defeat communism. And we saw this with the expansion of the Truman Doctrine, containment, things like this. Now, an important piece of legislation that they do put through Congress is the Taft-Hartley Act. Now, recall that during the New Deal, organized labor had won the right to collective bargaining, and they had won federal protection of that right. The Taft-Hartley Act effectively repeals that right. It allows states to enact what are called right-to-work laws, that is, forbidding unionization, which is the agency through which collective bargaining typically takes place. And it also requires unions to take non-communist oaths. A number of southern states are the ones who get on board with this, and they pass these right-to-work legislation, either restricting or abolishing the right to unionization. Texas is one of the states that does this, and Texas continues to be a right-to-work state today. Another thing that the Republicans do in 1946 is they take steps to block Truman's proposal to expand civil rights. Truman had a very ambitious plan that he put together called To Secure These Rights, which would effectively outlaw public discrimination. Well, the Republicans decide that this is not the place of the federal government to do this, and so they are going to block his proposal in Congress. In response to this, Truman is going to issue an executive order to wipe out segregation in the armed forces. So do write this down. This is something that you need to know, is that the armed forces are going to be desegregated in 1947 by President Harry Truman. Now, the Democrats, this is Harry Truman's party, the Democrats are so annoyed by this move that the southern wing of the party actually secedes in the upcoming election and forms what is called the States' Rights Democrats, or the States' Rights Party, also affectionately known as the Dixiecrats. And they're a third party. And their chief issue is opposition to federal intervention in their right to supposedly regulate race relations in the South. And so the States' Right Party, the Dixiecrats, they're going to be led by Strom Thurmond, and we will see more of them as we go on, but I'm pointing this out right away. This cartoon of Harry Truman right here. He proposes his Fair Deal, which is to expand the New Deal and secure some of the social programs that had begun under Franklin Roosevelt. And he is going to have a little bit of trouble actually moving around there. As you can see, the stiff-necked Republican Congress is going to hamper his movements. So you're asking, okay, why didn't we see a return to the Great Depression following World War II? Well, what brought America out of the Great Depression? It was World War II production and the massive amounts of deficit spending that accompanied it and employed people, and the huge defense contracts that went into places like Ford Motor Company and the Kaiser shipyards and things like this. So what happens when we demobilize is the big question. 60% of Americans expected their earnings to fall with demobilization. Fortune magazine reports in 1946 that the American soldier is depression conscious. He is worried sick about post-war joblessness. The reason we did not slip back into a Great Depression is because the government did not stop deficit spending. It really didn't stop or decrease in the 1950s. It simply took a different direction, from New Deal spending to military spending, and now we're looking at Cold War spending. And so even things that are primarily for public use are going to be justified as useful to the military. Let's take a look at a few of these. The GI Bill of Rights of 1944, the Federal Housing Act of 1944, a huge one called the Federal Highway Act of 1956, and then there are the countless defense contracts to private industry. All of these are going to set the pattern for the federal government to put forward the capital and private industry to do a lot of the work. A great way of looking at this is through the Federal Highway Act of 1956, which we're going to take a really close look at in a little bit. Congress realizes in 1944 that when the war ends, we're going to see a lot of returning servicemen coming home to the United States, and they're going to want jobs, and they're going to flood the job market, and there simply isn't going to be enough labor to go around. And so Congress passes the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, also known as the GI Bill of Rights, in 1944. One of the provisions in the GI Bill of Rights includes federal funding for college tuition, $500 a month, plus $50 living expenses, and if you're married, you can have $75. Now, this is to take some of this, some of these young men that would be going into the job market and offer them another place. How about going back to school? And this will free up more jobs for people who are already there. Another thing the GI Bill of Rights does, it provides federal housing loans so that servicemen can purchase a home and start a family. Another thing that it does is it provides for federal startup capital so that returning servicemen can start businesses and become entrepreneurs. So this is action taken by the federal government and a lot of money put forward by the federal government in order to keep the United States from slipping back into a Great Depression by putting servicemen in schools, by giving them federal housing loans, and providing loans so that they can start up their own businesses. Of course, we are in the context of the Cold War, and we've got to say hello to big government military spending. Government is going to invest heavily in big science justified by military preparedness. Things like plastics, things like new metal alloys, things like improved radio and television technologies. NASA, we're going to see. For the Federal Highway Act and even microwaves. All of these things are going to be funded by the federal government, and private industry is going to do the hiring, which is going to be jobs, jobs, jobs. So let's look at how the workplace is adapting to the new massive infusions of federal money. Automation is becoming the order of the day. From 1947 to 1957, factory workers are decreasing by 4.3%, and that eliminates 1.5 million blue-collar jobs. Now, by 1956, we're adding white-collar jobs. More white-collar jobs exist in the U.S. than do blue-collar jobs. Computers, most famously the Mark I, which makes its debut in 1944, is the first IBM mainframe computer. Corporate consolidation is also a trend that we look at in the 1950s. By 1960, the end of the decade, there are 600 corporations. That is 1/2 of all U.S. companies, accounting for 53% of total corporate income. Why is this? Again, it's the Cold War military buildup that is influencing the private sector. Government is providing the capital, and the private industry is doing the work. This is what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. Well, here's the United States. By car, it can take up to 5 weeks to get across the U.S. Of course, that's not an actual road. That's just me suggesting what a mess it can be. Now, President Eisenhower believes that a national road system is necessary. He says this would be good for business, this would be good for commerce, this would be good for all sorts of things, and we can knit the country back together economically if we can get a national road system. Now the problem is, remember the Republicans who returned to Congress? They say enough with the big government spending already. We don't want to put forward any kind of money for a huge national road service. There's all sorts of fights against this. It's called socialism. It was called fascism. The idea actually came from Hitler's work in Germany, which provided a lot of jobs. Well, Eisenhower still thinks it's a really good idea. What do we do with this? What if we were attacked, says Eisenhower? Wouldn't we want a quick and easy way to get military personnel to the site of the invasion? And wouldn't it be great if we could use these federally funded highways to land aircraft? Well, the Republican Congress says, sounds like a good idea, and they agree to turn over the cash to fund the development of the public road system. So it is called, and you should know this, the Interstate Highway Act of 1956. First proposed by Eisenhower in 1953. The Interstate Highway Act of 1956 authorizes funding, federal funding, to build 41,000 miles of highways with multi-lane expressways that are to connect America's towns and cities. This is a classic example of Cold War liberalism. Government supplies the capital, private industry does the work. It creates jobs, jobs, jobs. It's the biggest expenditure on a public work in all of world history. That's right, bigger than the Great Wall of China. $26 billion are going to be needed to complete the project. The federal government is going to pay an astounding 90% of the cost of expressway construction. That's going to be funded by a 3 cents a gallon tax on gasoline. So how is this Interstate Highway Act supposed to promote economic growth? And in fact, it does. It makes commuting to work a reality. So people can now move to suburbs and drive into the cities. It also causes businesses to pop up, such as McDonald's or drive-in theaters. These would have been unthinkable before the Federal Highway Act. Also, think about places like Disneyland, which opens in 1955, and Las Vegas, which receives a new lease on life in the 1950s once people can easily drive to them. So all of this driving is, of course, going to make the car culture of the 1950s a permanent fixture of the age. Moving on about that car culture, let's look. The number of registered automobiles jumped from 26 million in 1945 to 60 million in 1960. So in about a decade, the number of cars doubles. They had big engines and they employed the newest technology. Power steering, automatic transmission, power brakes. Everybody's gotta have them. The car culture stimulated hundreds of other industries. Think about drive-in movies, drive-through restaurants, travel motels, etc. All of this means jobs. All of this means economic expansion. All of this was started by that Federal Highway Act of 1956. And so with the excess cash that we're going to see floating through the economy, We're going to see the return of the consumer. He really has gone away. He first showed up in the 1920s, but now he is back. The Great Depression and World War II, as you know, put the production of consumer goods on hold. But Cold War prosperity and Cold War liberalism makes them soar again. The median family income rises in the 1950s from $3,319 to $5,417. This is twice the real income of the average family in the 1920s. So this is a time of really unprecedented prosperity for a lot of Americans. This means, of course, appliances, appliances, appliances. We should have kitchen appliances like washing machines and refrigerators, ice boxes. Don't forget, that's right, there's the television. You got 6,000 in 1946, 7 million of them in 1953. All babies were potential consumers, says Life magazine, who spearheaded a brand new market for food, clothing, and shelter. Speaking of babies, we have got to talk about the post-war baby boom. Well, you remember those people on VJ Day, Victory Over Japan Day. Well, they apparently got married and started a family. Returning soldiers were often anxious to get married and start families. The GI Bill gave them an education, Cold War spending gave them jobs, so why not? So the number of babies born in the U.S. is going to increase exponentially from about 1946 through around 1955, 56, approaching 1960. After that, of course, it does drop off, but take a look at the huge post-war boom in babies that we see. Pretty cool. Well, with all these new babies to take care of, childcare becomes a very lucrative industry. And the reason for that has to do with suburbanization. So think about this. Suburbs are little tiny cities that pop up outside of great big cities. And this is made possible, of course, through the Highway Act of 1956. Now, when families can move away and start commuting to work and commuting to the mall and commuting to the job and commuting to all these other places, this means that mom and dad can live in one city and grandma and grandpa can live in another city and aunt and uncle can live in another city, and they can live in cities that are quite some distance from each other. And what this does is it dislocates the family from the traditional sources of wisdom. What does that mean? You are no longer right next door to your mom and dad. And so when you get married and you have children, guess what? You don't just walk next door and say, Mom, how do I feed this baby? When does this baby sleep? How do I know what normal is? This is what families used to do. This is how families used to find out how to deal with children. Now we're going to have to turn to Dr. Benjamin Spock, not to be confused with Leonard Nimoy from Star Trek. Dr. Benjamin Spock is a real person, and he puts out Dr. Benjamin Spock's Baby and Child Care, which becomes a huge bestseller. It's going to tell you everything from how to put a baby to sleep, to how to mix formula, to how to properly discipline children. Things that you used to ask your family about, now you go to the child care industry. Experts begin to worry that as children grow up away from the sources of traditional wisdom, away from grandparents, away from the extended family, that they're becoming too permissive. Child caring is becoming too much of a laissez-faire activity, so to speak, without enough control. And there's too much worry or children are far too emphasized, spending too much time in material pursuits. Parents had grown up, after all, in the Great Depression and in World War II, and had known privation and had not grown up with all kinds of consumer goods surrounding them. The time is past, says Life magazine in August 31st, 1959, when a boy's chief possession was his bike and a girl's party wardrobe consisted of a fancy dress worn with a string of dime store pearls. Today's teenagers surround themselves with a fantastic array of garish and often expensive baubles and amusements. They own 10 million phonographs, that's record players, over 1 million TV sets, and 13 million cameras. And of course, the family that lives in suburbia is often idealized by the television. Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, and The Donna Reed Show, all giving us picture-perfect images of suburban white families that don't have any real problems. Have a look at this advertisement. It's an American serviceman who's just returned home from the war. And what's he drawing in the dirt there? It's a house. She exclaims, it's a promise. You see, the GI Bill and the federal housing subsidies made it possible for American servicemen to become homeowners very quickly. And so a housing developer by the name of William Levitt figured out how to make houses cheap and quickly. He mass-produced houses row upon row using the same rotation of designs again and again and again. He might have only had 4 or 5 different designs that he would use for in each housing development, and so you would see duplicates of the same house, 4 or 5 of the same house on each and every street. He built the first master community on Long Island, New York, and for $58 a month, almost anyone could own a home in Levittown. So there is the very first one, Levittown in Long Island, New York. And it wasn't long before he set sights on another location in Pennsylvania. So there's Levittown, Pennsylvania. Can you tell the difference? And of course, the third one opened up very soon, Levittown, New Jersey. And if you're thinking, well, I can't tell the difference in any of these housing communities, that's exactly the point. They're the same housing community with the same houses reproduced again and again and again. And some critics begin to remark that as we fear the social conformity and equality imposed on people by the totalitarian Soviet system, we seem to be opting into our own system of conformity here at home. So here's an overview of Levittown. That's either New York or New Jersey or Pennsylvania. What does it matter? Levittown spawned dozens of imitators outside of major cities, and suburbanization became a way of life for the nuclear white family. And I do mean the nuclear, that is mom, dad, 2.5 kids, and a dog. And yes, they're white. The federal government facilitated this migration to the suburbs through low-interest loans and subsidized highways. Once again, this is a product of Cold War liberalism. The federal government puts the cash up forward, and private industry does the work. Suburban communities eventually became self-contained, having their own schools, churches, shopping, etc., and it got to the point where you didn't ever really have to leave. And so this leads to a phenomenon called white flight. Many housing developments simply did not sell to black families. Advertisement for Levittown, New Jersey, and as you can see, the self-contained community is evident. For it's highlighting the community, look under houses. 3 distinctly different houses are now being exhibited. Imagine the variety. 3 distinctly different houses. Where do you live? You live in Eagle Springs, you live in Walden, you live in one of these communities around here. What if there were only 3 different floor plans? Ah, lovely. Schools and swimming pools, shopping. What about black people? No. William Levitt comments on this. William Levitt was a Jew, and he said, as a Jew, I have no room in my mind or heart for racial prejudice. But, by various means, I have come to know that if we sell one house to a Negro family, then 90 to 95% of our white customers will not buy into the community. That is their attitude, not ours. So William Levitt communicating his acquiescence to the racism that surrounds Levittown, USA. And so if you could peer inside one of these 3 or 4 different floor plans, here's what you would see. The happy housewife toiling away, smile on her face. Life magazine reports in 1956 that the ideal modern woman married, cooked, and cared for her family, and kept herself busy by joining the local PTA and leading a troupe of campfire girls. She entertained guests in her family's suburban house and worked out on the trampoline to keep her size 12 figure. Sounds like an absolutely charming life, does it not? One woman who does not find this existence all that charming is Betty Friedan, who publishes in 1963 a runaway bestseller called The Feminine Mystique. The problem lay buried, Betty Friedan writes, unspoken for many years in the minds of American women. It was a strange stirring, a sense of dissatisfaction, a yearning that women suffered in the middle of the 20th century in the United States. Each suburban housewife struggled with it alone, as she made the beds, shopped for groceries, matched slipcover material, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, chauffeured Cub Scouts and brownies, lay beside her husband at night. She was afraid to ask even of herself the silent question, is this all? An interesting change happens to religion in the 1950s. It becomes far less partisan, far less doctrinal, and more, American. Let me explain what I mean. You are looking at an animation of the Reverend Billy Graham. The Reverend Billy Graham is a Baptist evangelist, and he would pack stadiums full of spectators, and he still would, he's actually still alive, to deliver a Christian message laced with anti-communist rhetoric. He fit the 1950s perfectly. He's all-American, and he's Christian. And he issues a challenge to American Christians. Be committed to Jesus and be against communism. And they are synonymous. They're one and the same. You cannot do one without the other. Here's what I mean. In one of his sermons from 1957, called Christ Demanded No Less, the Reverend Billy Graham says, "The world is engaged in a titanic struggle. There is a philosophy sweeping the world like fire called communism, which many people believe to be a Christian heresy. Lenin, that's Vladimir Lenin of the Soviet Union, began in 1917 by going across part of Germany to Russia with 40,000 men. Today, the communists control about 800 million people and are penetrating every part of the world. They are challenging the Christian church as it never has been challenged before." So while Billy Graham is a supporter of containment, he's a supporter of the bipartisan struggle against communism, he is wrapping it up in a distinctly Protestant evangelical message, insisting that it is the duty of every good Christian not only to devote yourself to Jesus Christ, but also to devote yourself to the struggle against communism. Catholics, too, are now included in the new American civic religion. The Roman Catholic bishop Fulton Sheen had a weekly television show called Life is Worth Living, and he reached up to 10 million people a week with an uplifting message on Christian morality. And he didn't hide the fact that he was Catholic, and he didn't try to soften his doctrinal stances either. He would come out every week in a big black cope. It's not a cape. It's actually called a cope, C-O-P-E. And he would deliver a message that was completely in keeping with the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. But what made the Reverend Fulton Sheen different now is that he helped to change the public image of the Roman Catholic Church. You recall that historically, many Protestant Christians had been skeptical of the church. What helped bring them in? What helped make Catholics now acceptable to mainstream Protestant society? The fact that they were anti-Catholic really helped. At a time when Americans were identifying themselves as a Christian society, not a doctrinally proclaiming Christian society. This is not the same thing as we saw in the 20s or in the 1830s. This is a civic religion. It's expressing itself in civic terms. The Reverend Bolton Sheen, Bishop Fulton Sheen, helped to change the image of the Roman Catholic Church, not by being something that he wasn't, but now America is changing to accept Catholics more. And he was so popular that he helped to smooth the path for the first, and so far only, Catholic president that the United States has ever had elected in 1960, and that would, of course, be John F. Kennedy. What is going on with religion? Well, as I said, some of the old antagonisms between Protestants and Catholics became less intense as we realize that both Protestants and Catholics have an ally on one another when it comes to opposing communism. Churches emphasized a Judeo-Christian heritage. And that is a term that finds its origin in the 1950s. You would not speak of a Judeo-Christian heritage before the 1950s. Such a concept had not been conceived. But now that we're coming into this civic religion, we can speak of just that. So patriotism and Christianity become synonymous, and doctrinal differences become muted. So the differences that once divided Methodists and Baptists are suddenly not as important. And whether or not you believe that the Eucharist is the true body and blood, and I believe that it's symbolic, is suddenly not really the point anymore. And do you baptize infants? Because I only baptize adults. Well, what really matters is the fundamentals. So look at what happens to church membership. In 1940, you've got 64 million church people that are members of a church. Now, by 1960, 20 years later, 114 million people are proclaiming membership in a church. Time magazine says in 1954 that today in the U.S., the Christian faith is back in the center of things. The Christian Century proclaims in the same year, it is un-American to be unreligious. This is also the time when Hollywood made the great Bible epics such as The Robe in 1953, everybody's heard of the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston in 1956, and of course Ben-Hur also with Charlton Heston in 1959. Nothing too controversial, nothing too divisive, simply the casts of thousands proclaiming America's Judeo-Christian heritage. One point must be made. The 1950s religion is not the return of fundamentalism. This is not to say that fundamentalists didn't participate in 1950s religion. They most certainly did. But mainly, what we're seeing is an expression of civic religion. It's an embrace of religion for patriotic or nationalist purposes. The United States is a Christian nation because the Soviet Union is an atheist nation. Let me show you two examples of how that is expressed. One, for example, is in our dollar bill. Pull it out and look at it, and you'll see it says, "In God We Trust," on the national currency. This only goes back to 1954. Another thing that you'll notice is in the Pledge of Allegiance, also in 1954, Congress voted to add "under God" into the pledge that we say every day around second or third period. Why is this? Why now? It has to do with the official doctrines of Marxism, which is atheism. Karl Marx says that religion is the opiate of the people, and the Soviet Union, which is claiming to follow the dictates of Karl Marx, is officially an atheistic society. Therefore, the United States is going to distinguish itself from the atheistic USSR by proclaiming and celebrating our Judeo-Christian heritage. Back to the impact of the television. By 1945 and 1960, Americans purchased TVs at a faster rate than cars or radios in the 1920s, making it by far the most influential piece of technology of the decade. Television, like the internet today and like the radio in the 1920s, helped to usher in a cultural revolution. The TV reinforced a shared sense of Americanness by promoting a generally homogeneous picture of American families and of American values, even if those families and those values were somewhat mythologized, as we shall see. Kids could rush home to see shows like Howdy Doody and the Mickey Mouse Club, which debuted in the 1950s, and for the grown-ups, TV provided a new medium for politics. And anybody who grew up in the late 1950s and knows anything about the 1960 election knows that the Nixon-Kennedy debates were the first televised political debates on TV. An interesting thing about these debates is that those who listened on the radio thought that Nixon was the clear winner, while those who watched on television saw the smiling and suntanned Kennedy and thought that Kennedy had won, showing you that the new medium is certainly a cultural force to be reckoned with. If you're going to talk about TV in the 50s, you have got to talk about the number one show of the decade and perhaps even of all time. It's called I Love Lucy. I Love Lucy aired from 1951 to 1957, and it was the most watched show in the U.S. for 4 of its 6 seasons. Lucy set the standard. She was one of the first to use live television audiences, and she invented the snappy one-liners that have become the staple of the 30-minute sitcom that's so popular today. Now, Lucy both reflected popular ideas about how married couples should relate to each other. For example, Lucy and her husband Ricky slept in separate beds. Now, this was a myth. Most married couples in the 50s did not sleep in separate beds, but we like to believe that they did. On the other hand, Lucy also challenged popular ideas. Lucy had the first interracial couple. Lucy's husband, Ricky, was Cuban. And there's no way I can let anybody escape this YouTube PowerPoint without talking about the 1950s Western. As I've told you guys a lot, I did my master's thesis on the imagined West, and I got to talk a whole lot about Buffalo Bill and the 1950s cowboy shows and things like that. So, during the 1950s, Hollywood made hundreds, literally hundreds, of Western films and TV shows in the early 1950s and 60s. They emphasized the ideas of freedom, masculinity, and a violent frontier, such as Gunsmoke, which ran from 1952 to 1961. Why is this happening? I have wondered a lot about why Westerns are popular. And one of the things that I discovered in my research is that the TV Western and the movie Western are popular during times when the United States is not at war. Perhaps it's a surrogate for violence. So the 50s is a time when we're not at war. We do, of course, have the Cold War, but this is an understated war. This is a war of ideologies, not of direct fighting. And so perhaps we're acting out our desire to go out and beat up on the Soviets through the Western. Who knows? Like we said, some of this cultural history is like nailing Jell-O to a wall. It's very difficult to make stick. There's also a suggestion that the open range appeals to Americans who are enclosed by suburbs. So maybe all of that confinement brought about by Levittown and Levitville and Levitt City and whatever we're calling it, maybe that is having a cultural sense of boxing people in, and we want to feel like we can still go out and experience the open range as they supposedly did in the 1860s and 70s. Who knows? One of the themes that I think is a little bit easier to interpret, however, is the apocalyptic invasion motif. Every time you opened up a new comic book, went to the movies, or turned on the TV, you could find somebody telling you of the impending invasion from outer space. Movies like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Invasion from Mars, The Day the World Ended, and many, many others told of the space aliens who were lurking just beyond the clouds and waiting to descend and enslave mankind. Of course, we're talking about a metaphor for the invasion of the Soviet Union. So overall, what did 1950s television give us? Well, in all, it's going to give us an idealized American family. There's no divorce or no serious social issues in the 1950s sitcom. It gave us the impression that everybody was both suburban and white. And it gives us a firm picture of gender roles, women in the home, men at the office. It also reinforces the belief that all problems can be solved in 22 minutes. Not so fast. My favorite television show from the 1950s, and even my favorite television show perhaps of all time, is The Twilight Zone. Well, I think that The Twilight Zone is one of the best shows ever. It ran from 1958 to 1964 and was the brainchild of the cinematic genius Rod Serling, who wrote and directed the majority of the episodes. The Twilight Zone is subtly critical of 1950s culture, including Cold War paranoia. And I think this is demonstrated in the episode called The Shelter, in which a group of suburbanites discover that when the bomb is dropped, there isn't enough room in the fallout shelter for everybody, and so they've got to make some pretty tough decisions. And at the same time, The Twilight Zone also offers a stern warning against totalitarianism, both at home and abroad. And this is demonstrated through the episode The Obsolete Man, in which an individual is faced with a totalitarian regime in an Orwellian-like setting who wants to control his every thought and his every belief. This also criticized 1950s standards of beauty and conformity, and I'm just going to let you Google that one and learn about it on your own. The 1950s also sees the emergence of a new type of artistic and musical expression known as rock and roll. It begins in the summer of 1951, in which a radio DJ from Cleveland begins broadcasting a sampling of music from down south that he calls race music. He eventually gave it the name rock and roll, and it marks the beginning of a cultural revolution that has not stopped to this day. Rock and roll will soon dominate the airwaves, becoming the most listened to musical style worldwide. Rock and roll is a synthesis of jazz, R&B, and Southern country music. It used to be called boogie woogie, said Chuck Berry. It used to be called blues, used to be called rhythm and blues. It's now called rock. But because of its association with black people, many Americans in the 1950s were suspicious of the new type of rock music. Congress even held hearings to decide if rock music contained communist influences, and at length they decided it did not. Ministers also complained of rock music's sexual permissiveness. Nobody, however, embodied the spirit of rock and roll more than the performer Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley, who we remember today as the king of rock and roll, grew up in Memphis, Tennessee in a predominantly black community. And he listened to black gospel, to R&B, and to jazz artists. And when he began performing on his own, he simply integrated what he knew and what he had grown up listening to into his own musical style. And his first listeners, when they heard him on Memphis radio, assumed that Elvis Presley was black. Well, Elvis received mainstream white radio play in January of 1956 with Heartbreak Hotel, which became his first #1 hit. Does everybody think that Elvis is the king, though? Nope, not everybody does. Frank Sinatra, who represents perhaps a more conservative style of music in the 1950s, said his, that is Elvis's, kind of music is deplorable, a rancid-smelling aphrodisiac. It fosters almost totally negative and destructive reactions in young people. Frank Sinatra was not alone in expressing these beliefs. Elvis was new, and he was considered to be a threat, not only to the musical status quo, but to the racial status quo and the cultural status quo. And so when Elvis performs on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1956, guess what? Ed Sullivan refused to film Elvis's hips. They were considered to be far too scandalous for mainstream viewers to look at. Another cultural development of the 1950s we all know and love today is the moody teenager. Not kids in the 1950s began to express discontent and frustration with adult culture, finding it to be disingenuous or phony. Teenager enters the popular vocabulary in the 1950s. And this is interesting because this signifies that being a teenager is a distinctive stage in development. Do fiction and literature of the 1950s reflect, or do they create this image? Something that cultural historians have been debating for quite a while. But you do have movies like 1955's Rebel Without a Cause, starring, of course, the now iconic James Dean. You've got Catcher in the Rye, which is features Holden Caulfield, the young teenager who finds all adult society to just be a big joke, and this is where he uses and overuses the word phony. There's also the motorcycle riding rebel Marlon Brando in The Wild One, and one of my personal favorites to think about is a poem by Allen Ginsberg called Howl. Allen Ginsberg's Howl is considered absolute trash in the 1950s when it's first published, but now we look back on it as the beginning of a cultural poetic movement that has its resonances even today. He writes, I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn looking for an angry fix, angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo in the machinery of night, who poverty and tatters and hollow-eyed and high sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of cold water flats floating across from the tops of cities contemplating jazz, who bared their brains to heaven under El and saw Mohammedan angels staggering on tenement roofs eliminated, who passed through universities with radiant cool eyes, hallucinating Arkansas and Blake-like tragedy among the scholars of war. Well, that is certainly a mouthful, and it's certainly a brainful of images that one would take a lifetime to disseminate and to interpret. I think it's absolutely fascinating. Well, Ginsberg is the poet laureate of a group that is unofficially known as the Beat Poets, or the Beatniks. The Beats, they're the original hipster club. They're the coffee house bohemian who refused to conform to 1950s society. And they displayed their distrust, their distrust, and their distaste with mainstream society in both poetry and prose. Jack Kerouac, who wrote On the Road, expresses this quite well. He writes, "The only people for me are the mad ones, the ones who are mad to live, mad to talk, mad to be saved, the ones who never yawn or say a commonplace thing, but burn, burn, burn like fabulous yellow Roman candles exploding like fire spiders across the sky." A lot of imagery packed into that sentence, a lot of things to think about. I kind of like the Beat Poets, you know, they're an interesting group for me. And so, I think I'll read to you one of my favorite Beat poems, Woman. Woman, whoa man, whoa man. She was a thief, you gotta believe. She stole my heart and my cat. Betty, Judy, girls in cartoons won't leave me in ruins. I want to be Betty's Barney. Hey Jane, get me off this crazy thing called love. Okay, so this Beat poem is not actually from the 1950s. It's from 1993 and was featured in the Mike Myers film, So I Married an Axe Murderer. Nevertheless, I think it's representative of the genre, and I had to share it with you nonetheless. And the last book that we are looking at is Alfred Kinsey's Sexual Behavior of the Human Male. This one really raises a lot of red flags with people because for the first time it openly discussed sexual orientation and behavior, subjects that were taboo in polite company prior to the 1960s. And so Kinsey's research is going to help contribute to the sexual revolution of the 1960s, which we're going to put off for another day. Well, I hope you guys remember the first Red Scare of the 1920s. It was led by, of course, A. Mitchell Palmer and J. Edgar Hoover, who was appointed head of the Anti-Radicalism Department in 1924, which later became the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or the FBI. Now, in the 1950s, Edgar is still around. He's still head of the FBI, and he's just as paranoid about communists in the 50s as he was in the 20s. Now, President Truman's Attorney General is J. Howard McGrath, who tells us communists are everywhere, in factories, offices, butcher stores, on street corners, and private businesses, and each carries in himself the death of our society. In the 1950s, images such as these pervade the popular culture, telling Americans to build bomb shelters in their background and publishing books on how to survive the coming atomic holocaust. You could even go to Sears and pick up the do-it-yourself shelter for around $150 to $200. It will instruct you on how to dig a hole in your backyard, what materials to use, and what sort of structure you'll need to build to best protect yourself and your family in the coming atomic holocaust. But it looks like in the bottom, folks, there's something for the entire family. Mom and dad reading up, somebody taking a nap over there, somebody playing with a toy, and of course there's a girl playing on the ground. Now, if you happen to be on a budget, you could spend several years in this cocoon-looking thing. I can't imagine anybody would buy into that. But, nevertheless, these things sold. There's several atomic shelters on display in Houston that you can Google. And the owners will be happy to take you on a guided tour if you'd like. Sort of one of the odd curiosities that you can still find in urban centers today. Public schools often drilled teachers in how to conduct bomb raid techniques. Duck and cover was the watchword of the day, and students would be instructed on how to properly hit the ground, cover their neck and heads, and prepare for the coming atomic blast, which would give you very little warning. And one of the films that I want to explore in class stars Bert the Turtle, who gives us the 1950s defense educational film on how to do just this. Duck and cover. There he goes, Bert. Look, there he is. Well, during the second Red Scare of the 1950s, President Truman creates by executive order the Federal Employee Loyalty Program of 1947. It gives his Attorney General McGrath and the FBI unprecedented powers to go through the personal and professional lives of government employees. They investigate the private lives of anybody working for the federal government. About 3,000 employees are screened and found to be subversive. Now, the government also begins a list of people who had unsavory political associations and begins to follow these people throughout the rest of their lives and careers. Truman considers the loyalty program to be the biggest blunder of his presidency. This is interesting considering this is the man who dropped the atomic bomb. But nevertheless, this is what he considers to be a problem for him. Now, why did we find so many subversive people? Is this all just a bunch of overstatement? Well, not really when you consider that a lot of people were around during the Great Depression when the Communist Party and the The Popular Front was an attractive option for a lot of people who believe that capitalism had failed. And now they find themselves having to defend those political associations or leftist beliefs now that we're engaged in a new Cold War with the Soviet Union. Also during the Second Red Scare, President Truman uses the Smith Act, which was passed by Congress in 1940, and this made it a crime to advocate the violent overthrow of the U.S. government. Now, in 1940, we were more concerned about fascists and Nazis than we were about Soviet communists, but nevertheless, Truman used this, and it led to the conviction of 11 communists who had joined during the Great Depression, and for that crime were sent to prison. The Second Red Scare also breathes new life into the House of Un-American Activities known as HUAC. They were formed also during the struggle against Nazism in 1938 in order to counter the influence of Nazism and fascism in the United States, and they found a renewed purpose in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. Now, HUAC conducts highly publicized hearings on the supposedly communist activities inside the United States. Their favorite targets are scientists, labor unions, newspaper publishers, university professors, and teachers. The hearing that gained the greatest publicity dealt with a group known as the Hollywood 10. The Hollywood 10 were a group of 10 Hollywood writers, directors, and producers who were accused, of one time anyway, of being communists. And so HUAC is going to put them on trial, and they're going to be told to name additional members of the Communist Party with whom they've had affiliations. Now, the Hollywood 10 refused to comply, stating that the Fifth Amendment says that you do not have to offer any evidence that would incriminate you. And this is what the Fifth Amendment says. And so they're saying that if I name communists, then you're going to associate me with those communists and I'll be in trouble. Here is a sampling of one of these Hollywood 10 HUAC hearings. The spokesman says, "Are you a member of the Screenwriters Guild?" And Sam Ornitz, who is a screenwriter, says, "I wish to reply to that question by saying that this involves a serious question of conscience." Conscience? Conscience. I say you do raise a serious question of conscience for me when you ask me to act in concert with you to override the Constitution. Mr. Chairman, wait a minute. Asking me to violate the constitutional guarantee of... This witness is through. Stand away. So as you can see, HUAC was willing to sidestep or overlook what is guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution under the Fifth Amendment. And again, even though we're not directly involved in a war, this is seen as a matter of national security. And we saw in World War I with the Espionage Act. We saw in World War II with Japanese internment that during times of national emergency, the government is often willing to take liberties with the Bill of Rights. One of the more notable Americans who participated with HUAC in 1947 was the then actor Ronald Reagan. And as you know, Ronald Reagan is going to become President of the United States in 1980 and is going to lead a resurgent conservative movement that goes from 1980 till at least 1988. So here he is before HUAC testifying. Ronald Reagan says 99% of us, that is, those of us in Hollywood, are pretty well aware of what is going on, and I think within the bounds of our democratic rights. We have done a pretty good job in our business of keeping those people's, that is, the supposed communists, activities curtailed. After all, we must recognize them at present as a political party. On that basis, we have exposed their lies when we came across them, we have opposed their propaganda, and I can say certainly testify that in the case of the Screen Actors Guild, we have been eminently successful in preventing them from with their usual tactics, trying to run a majority of an organization with a well-organized minority. So there's Ronald Reagan, who is at this time making a political transition and a personal transition from a New Deal Democrat to a resurgent Republican, part of the new conservatism that is going to express itself in the 1960s and then come into its own in the 1980s. Here's a poster warning Americans not to patronize the Reds. And that is, let's not watch television or movies that we feel is containing communist messages. It reads, you can drive the Reds out of television and Hollywood. The Reds have made our screen, radio, and TV Moscow's most effective fifth column in America. How about that? Moscow is directing our television programs. The Reds of Hollywood and Broadway have always been the chief financial support of communist propaganda in America. Well, how about that? The communists from Russia are the ones that are funding American TV. So remember, if you patronize, that is, watch a film made by Red producers, writers, stars, and studios, you are aiding and abetting communism. Every time you permit Reds to come into your living room via your TV set, you are helping Moscow and the internationalists destroy America. So this is quite heavy-handed and quite overstated. There is no direct communist influence coming from Moscow into American homes via the television, but this is how how HUAC and how a lot of the more paranoid folks within the Second Red Scare are relating to this. And so it is probably no surprise to you that during the 1950s, Hollywood behaves itself, making, of course, the great biblical epics, but also movies such as I Married a Communist and Invasion of the Body Snatchers, both of which carry strong anti-communist messages. And they stay away from controversial topics or topics that may carry a leftist or any kind of message that could be interpreted as anti-American or pro-communist. Some Hollywood actors even go as far as to take out ads within magazines in order to defend themselves against what they feel would be communist attacks. Here's one by Humphrey Bogart, who takes out a full-page ad in a major American magazine, and his picture there says, "I'm no communist," and he's going to tell you why. Well, demonstrating just how far-reaching the paranoia of the 1950s became, even J. Robert Oppenheimer was brought before HUAC on charges of having communist associations in 1954. Now, you'll recall that J. Robert Oppenheimer was the chief physicist in charge of the Manhattan Project, which helped to develop the atomic bomb and defeat Imperial Japan during World War II. Well, it turns out that J. Robert Oppenheimer knew people who may have had communist connections in the 1930s. Well, like I said before, there was quite a few people who had communist connections during the 1930s when it was seen to be a viable alternative to capitalism during the Great Depression. But no evidence ever turned up to prove that Oppenheimer himself was a member of the Communist Party. Nevertheless, there are real communists in America, and there are real communist spies. Have a look at this guy. His name is Alger Hiss. He's a seemingly squeaky clean government employee, and he had been at work on several New Deal agencies in the 1930s and 40s, and had helped to organize the UN after World War II in 1945. This is Whittaker Chambers. Whittaker Chambers had been a communist in the 1930s, but he had turned against it and become a fierce anti-communist who helps the U.S. government to expose other communists. So Chambers then accuses Alger Hiss of being a communist in the 30s. He says he knew the man for years, and he can promise you Hiss is a communist. Well, there's Alger Hiss before HUAC. He denies that he was ever a communist. He denies that he ever knew Chambers, and he denies any association with radicalism whatsoever. And HUAC is about to let the guy go on lack of evidence. But one junior congressman from California, his name is Richard M. Nixon, believes that Hiss is hiding something, that Alger Hiss is not telling the whole truth, and this must be pursued. So Richard Nixon relentlessly investigates the Alger Hiss case. He combs through document after document, looking for some kind of hole in Hiss's story and looks for something to corroborate Whittaker Chambers' accusations that he is a communist. It turns out that Chambers did in fact know Hiss, and Richard Nixon is able to discover this by looking at secret government documents that Chambers had hidden in a hollowed-out pumpkin, and this becomes known as the Pumpkin Papers. The Pumpkin Papers contains a microfilm that definitively connect Alger Hiss with the Communist Party, proving that Hiss had been lying all along. He had been a communist and he had known Whittaker Chambers. Well, this crusading anti-communist Richard Nixon emerges from the Alger Hiss case as a national hero, so well known and respected that when Dwight D. Eisenhower runs for president in 1952, he drafts Richard Nixon as his vice presidential running mate. Another case that we're going to look at has to do with a man named Klaus Fuchs. Klaus Fuchs was a German-American scientist who worked on the Manhattan Project during World War II, and is charged in 1950 with selling atomic secrets to the Soviet Union, which eventually led to the development of the Soviet Union's first hydrogen bomb. So this is how the story goes. He supplies these top secret documents to a guy named David Greenglass. David Greenglass then hands over these documents to Julius Rosenberg, who is his brother-in-law, and he sold them to the Soviet Union. So there below are Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Now the Rosenbergs, when they're brought before HUAC, they claim that they are innocent of any wrongdoing. They've never received or delivered any information. And they also say that the trial is more about anti-Semitism than about atomic secrets. You see, the Rosenbergs were Jewish, and they are claiming that this is just a show of anti-Semitism. Well, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were tried under the Espionage Act, which, as you recall, was passed during World War I in 1918. And as with the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, much of the prosecution's case depended on the couple's affiliation with the American Communist Party, and a lot of Americans are not entirely convinced that the prosecution made its case for these two actually selling atomic secrets to the communists. As with the Hollywood 10, they pleaded the Fifth Amendment when asked if they were communists. They were found guilty of espionage, and the judge delivers a very scathing opinion upon sentencing. I consider your crime worse than murder. Plain, deliberate, contemplated murder is dwarfed in magnitude by comparison with the crime you have committed. In committing the act of murder, the criminal kills only his victim. In your case, I believe your conduct in putting into the hands of the Russians the A-bomb years before our best scientists predicted Russia would perfect the bomb has already caused, in my opinion, the communist aggression in Korea, which is going on at this point, with the resultant casualties exceeding 50,000, and who knows but that millions more of innocent people may pay the price of your treason. And at length, the Rosenbergs are both put to death for espionage. The electric chair is the means by which the judge sentences them to die. Well, in 1995, a series of previously top-secret intelligence documents were released to the public, and they are known by the codename of Venona. And so they're popularly known as the Venona Papers. They were a list generated by the Soviet Union of spies or potential collaborators that one can depend on within the U.S., and they contain the names of both Alger Hiss and the Rosenbergs, which proves definitively in 1995 that both are guilty. Well, the Alger Hiss trial and the execution of the Rosenbergs provides the backdrop against which Senator from Wisconsin Joseph McCarthy enters into public view. It was in the February of 1950 that Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin was nearing the end of his first term in the Senate. He was relatively unknown. He had not made a big impression on his constituency, had very little to show for his first couple years in the Senate. Meanwhile, Richard Nixon from California was making headlines with the Alger Hiss trials. And so in Wheeling, West Virginia, McCarthy held up a pile of papers and made a heart-stopping claim. "The reason why we find ourselves in a position of weakness," said Joseph McCarthy, "is not because the enemy has sent men to invade our shores, but rather because the traitorous actions of those who have had all the benefits that the wealthiest nation on earth has to offer, the finest homes, the finest college educations, and the finest jobs in government we can give. I have here in my hand a list of 250 individuals that were known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party, and who nevertheless are still working and shaping the policy of the State Department." Well, with these accusations, Joseph McCarthy is going to launch a movement that bears his name, known as McCarthyism, or the paranoid search for communists anywhere that they might be hiding. Well, McCarthy won his Senate seat again. And between 1950 and 1954, McCarthy was perhaps the most powerful politician in the United States. He's going to chair an investigations committee to look into the claims that are made by McCarthy himself. They're famously known as the McCarthy trials. In these trials, McCarthy is going to accuse numerous government officials and several others in private industry. He's never actually going to show anybody this list that he has. And on one occasion he says it's 205 names. On another occasion he says it's 300 names. And then it drops to 100 names. But no, you can't actually see them. That would give up my source, and then everybody would flee and we wouldn't actually catch them. Well, one famous accusation was hurled at George C. Marshall. Really? Yeah. You'll recall George C. Marshall is the architect of the Marshall Plan, which was designed to lift war-torn Western Europe out of the devastation of war so that they would not turn to communism. Nevertheless, Joseph McCarthy is going to say of George C. Marshall, "He is the worst sort of traitor. He is the head of a conspiracy on a scale so immense as to dwarf any previous venture in the history of man." That's right. There's Hitler, there's Stalin, there's Chairman Mao, and there's George C. Marshall. Well, McCarthy's reign is going to go on until 1954. He conducted his hearings until then. Now, he never successfully proved that anyone was a communist. But being accused by McCarthy was enough to ruin one's career. And no one wanted to oppose McCarthy because that may prove that you're you're in sympathy with the communists yourself, and you may find yourself facing McCarthy in the next trial. President Eisenhower didn't do much to stop McCarthy. He stayed clear of him, saying he didn't want to get down in the mud with that senator. Well, in 1954, McCarthy is running out of people in the State Departments to accuse of being communist. So, he turns to a new target, and he points his finger at the U.S. Army, and accuses the Army of being, quote, full of communists. Now, This is never a good idea. If you want to keep your face in the same condition that it is right now, never call a member of the U.S. Armed Forces a communist. Well, Joseph McCarthy takes his hearings to the next level. The Army McCarthy hearings are going to be televised at the request of the U.S. Army. Now, this is where most Americans see and hear McCarthy for the first time. They had been experiencing him in print, in which journalists would quote a little bit and editorialize and quote a little bit and paraphrase. Well, now Americans are exposed to McCarthy for who he really is. He's rude and he's crude and he bullies those that he accuses. And so Senator Joseph Welch has the courage enough to go on the counterattack. Up until this moment, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or recklessness. Little did I dream you could be so cruel as to do an injury to that lad, that is the young man that he's accusing. If it were in my power to forgive you for your reckless cruelty, I would do so. I like to think that I am a gentleman, but your forgiveness will have to come from someone other than me. Have you no decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency? This on national TV, Americans are watching, and it turns to be the point at which public support for McCarthy dwindles, and Americans wake up from something of a delusional nightmare and say, what have we been doing? What sort of crusade have we been feeding with our time and our energy? And so McCarthy is at length discredited. He never found a communist. He never proved that anybody was in league with the Soviet Union. And the Senate then censures him or reprimands him for conduct unbecoming of a senator. He dies a few years later of alcoholism, apparently in a deep depression over what had become of his life.